Hey guys, tonight we're heading back in time to a place that history books often paint with broad, glorious strokes. The medieval battlefield. Forget the Hollywood glamour, the perfectly choreographed duels, and the crisp, clean uniforms. Instead, let's step into a world of mud, sweat, and very, very bad hygiene. You're standing on a slightly sloping field. It's early morning. Maybe a touch of mist hangs in the air, and the ground beneath your worn leather boots is a mix of churned earth and yesterday's rain. The fog is thick enough to make the air feel damp, and it muffles the sounds of the men around you. A few coughs, the clink of a chainmail link, the low murmur of prayers. This isn't a scene of heroic grandeur. It's a cold, damp reality check. You can feel the weight of a shield on your arm, the rough wool of your tunic against your skin, and the dull thud of your own heart. You probably won't survive this, but we're going to see what it's like anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always appreciate you guys checking in. Why not post your location and local time down in the comments? It's always a treat to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as you stand here, surrounded by 1,000 of your closest new friends. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a complex bouquet of unwashed bodies, wet leather, stale smoke from last night's fires, and the nervous tang of human fear. Forget the romantic notion of shining nights. The man next to you probably hasn't had a proper bath in months, and the one behind you is still grumbling about the lack of decent food. A mainstream historical fact you probably know is that battles were rarely fought on perfectly flat ground. Commanders sought any slight advantage, so a gentle rise or a dry patch of earth was a luxury. But a quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval armies often hired professional flag bearers, the vexillarii, whose sole job was to hold the banner high. Even in the thickest fighting, they were often paid more than the average soldier because if the banner fell, morale would plummet, and the battle might be lost right there. Historians still argue whether the importance of the vexillarius was more practical for command or psychological for inspiring the troops. You shift your weight, your back complaining about the weight of your gear. The sun is just starting to burn through the fog, revealing the muddy patches and clumps of grass. You can hear the distant murmur of the other side, a low hum that sounds a little too much like a hornet's nest you're about to poke. You just hope the guy next to you knows what he's doing. You can feel his nervous energy radiating off him. But then you realize your own hands are shaking. This isn't a grand adventure, it's just a job. And right now, you'd rather be back home, complaining about the price of ale. But here you are, and there's nowhere to go but forward. The sun peeks over the horizon, painting the sky in a muted watercolor of grey and rose. The cold air bites at your exposed skin, and you find yourself rubbing your hands together, less for warmth and more to stop the slight tremble. The men around you are equally quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Some whisper prayers to whichever saint they hope is listening. Others simply stare ahead, their faces a mask of grim resolve. This isn't the loud, boisterous pre-battle scene you might imagine. It's the pre-dawn calm. A silence so thick it feels like a heavy blanket pulled over the entire field. It's a moment of profound psychological tension, a shared quiet before the unshareable chaos. You can hear the rhythmic breathing of the man next to you, a low, steady sound that is somehow both reassuring and deeply unnerving. A nervous cough from a few ranks back seems to shatter the stillness for a second, but it's quickly absorbed by the dense, heavy air. You check your gear for the 10th time. The weight of your mail shirt feels comforting, a familiar pressure against your shoulders. You run your hand over the hilt of your sword, a cheap, well-used thing that's more for last-ditch defense than anything else. You've had a quick bite of hard bread and salted meat, and your stomach is now a coiled knot of anticipation. There's a curious stillness to the whole affair. The enemy is there, a dark line on the distant rise. But for now, they are just a suggestion of what's to come. It's a mainstream historical fact that commanders often used the early morning hours for final troop movements and battle formation, taking advantage of the low light and the natural quiet. But here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some armies would deliberately use loud, rhythmic chanting or drumming at this time to unnerve their opponents. A sort of medieval psychological warfare. The goal wasn't to be heard clearly, but to create a low, menacing thrum that carried on the wind and got into the heads of the opposing soldiers. Historians still argue whether this was a common tactic or just a rare, clever trick. You catch a glimpse of the banner unfurling high above the command post, a flash of red and gold against the pale sky. The sight of it is a powerful anchor, a symbol of the cause you're here to fight for, or, more accurately, the Lord you're here to die for. You might not know the intricate heraldry, but you recognize the colors of your liege. A cold sense of fatalism settles over you. You've heard the stories of glorious victories and heroic charges, but what you're experiencing now is the mundane, slow-motion dread of waiting. This is the moment where the romantic ideals of chivalry and valor meet the cold, hard ground. There's a subtle but palpable energy flowing through the ranks, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and a desperate desire for this to be over. You can see the steam of your own breath in the cool air, a small, transient cloud that feels like a physical manifestation of your short time left on this earth. The silence is the worst part. It gives you too much time to think. It's the calm before the storm. But it's a calm that feels anything but peaceful. You just want the noise to start, the clatter of steel on steel, the shouts and screams, anything to break this agonizing quiet. The air feels heavy, pregnant with the promise of violence, and you just stand there, waiting. The silence, as heavy as a lead weight, finally breaks. It's not with a roar or a trumpet blast, but with a series of clipped commands barked by the sergeants. The orders are simple, practical, and devoid of any poetic flair. Shields up, spears forward. It's a mundane, almost boring start to what is supposed to be a momentous day. This is the morning routine, the final, desperate check of all the little details that might mean the difference between life and a messy death. You follow the commands, a well-drilled cog in a well-oiled machine. Your hand wraps around the worn leather grip of your shield, a solid circle of wood and metal that is your only real defense. You feel the weight of it, the satisfying balance. You hope the leather straps are in good condition and not frayed from too many drills. You lean your spear forward, its point glinting in the pale morning light, and test its weight. It's a simple tool, but a brutally effective one. The man next to you adjusts his helmet, the metal scraping against his chin strap. Another one tightens the laces on his boots. This isn't about grand gestures. It's about making sure your gear doesn't fail you at the worst possible moment. A mainstream historical fact is that soldiers spent a huge amount of their time on mundane tasks like this, maintaining their equipment, sharpening weapons, and mending armor. The glorious charge might last 10 minutes, but the preparation for it could take a week. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, many soldiers would carry a small, personal good luck charm. It might be a stone, a piece of wood, or a religious token. These weren't just for spiritual comfort, they were a way to feel some semblance of control in a situation where they had none. Historians still argue whether these charms provided genuine psychological benefits or if they were just a superstitious habit. You can see one guy a few ranks over holding a worn rabbit's foot, rubbing it between his fingers. You almost scoff, but then you find your own hand brushing against a small, smooth pebble in your tunic pocket, a stone you picked up from a stream years ago. We all have our little rituals, don't we? The air fills with the sounds of 1,000 small adjustments, the creak of leather, the jangle of chainmail, the quiet grunts of men settling into their positions. The command comes to tighten the ranks, and you shuffle forward, your shield overlapping with the man's next to you. You are no longer an individual, you are part of a human wall, a single, living, breathing organism. You can feel the nervous energy of the men around you, but it's a controlled nervousness, channeled into a singular purpose. You have trained for this, day after day, week after week, in rain and sun. The drills were brutal, but now, you understand why. The muscle memory takes over, your body knows what to do. Even if your mind is screaming, you can hear a senior officer, far up the line, shouting last-minute instructions. His voice is calm, clear, and reassuringly professional. You catch a few words, hold the line, and don't break formation. It's the same advice you've heard 100 times. You take a deep breath, and as you exhale, you can almost taste the fear in the air. This is the moment of truth, and all you can do is stand here, your shield up, your spear ready, and wait for the signal to move forward. The mundane preparation is over. The long, agonizing walk is about to begin. The signal comes, a trumpet sounds, a clear, sharp note that cuts through the morning air and the low hum of the waiting army. You feel a collective shudder pass through the ranks, and then, slowly, you begin to move. You are a part of a long, undulating line of humanity, trudging forward. You glance over to the flank and see the cavalry, the heavy hitters of the battlefield. They're an intimidating sight. The knights are mounted on massive war horses, their armor gleaming in the sun, their lances held high. They look like the living embodiment of valor and power, the heroes of every song and story. The very ground seems to tremble under their hooves. But here's the thing you don't realize from the stories. Heavy cavalry wasn't a silver bullet. A mainstream historical fact is that a well-executed cavalry charge was devastating. But it wasn't the end-all be-all. They were surprisingly vulnerable on uneven or soft ground. A small dip in the terrain, a patch of boggy earth, or a simple ditch could throw a charge into chaos, breaking up the tight formation and making the riders easy targets for foot soldiers. A quirky or fringe tidbit you wouldn't expect is that knights sometimes trained their horses to kick and bite on command, turning the animal itself into a weapon. This was a messy, dangerous tactic, but it added to the confusion and terror of a charge. Historians still argue whether this was a common training method or a more exotic practice reserved for a few elite knights. You watch as a few of the horses in the front ranks get spooked by a sudden noise and have to be reined in. You can see the frustration on the knights' faces as their perfect line is momentarily disrupted. This isn't a simple straight run, it's a complex, living entity. And it's just as susceptible to chaos as the rest of the army. You realize that their impressive armor, while great for protection, also makes them less agile. If a horse falls, the knight is in serious trouble. A very expensive turtle on the ground, struggling to right himself. You're a foot soldier, a grunt. You aren't mounted on a noble steed, and your armor is more about function than about looking impressive. You're a part of the infantry, the backbone of the army, and you know, deep down, that the cavalry charge is just the opening act. It's meant to disrupt, to create a hole in the enemy's line, a crack that the rest of you can pour through. But if it fails, or if it doesn't quite work, it will be up to you to face the enemy head-on. You can feel the weight of your own importance, not as an individual hero, but as part of an unbreakable, unglamorous mass. You can hear the thunder of the hooves as they begin to pick up speed. The ground trembles. You can feel the vibration through the soles of your boots. It's a terrifying, beautiful, and profoundly flawed machine of war. You just hope they hit their mark and don't get mired in a patch of mud you saw earlier. After all, it's not a movie, it's the real world. And in the real world, a hero on a horse can still trip over a loose stone. The cavalry charge has thundered past, a fleeting moment of impressive noise and motion. Now, the real work begins. You and the men around you are the infantry, the unglamorous, brutal core of this army. You are the wall of flesh and steel that will ultimately win or lose the day. Your line is now a slow, patient, and terrifying advance. It feels less like a charge and more like a grim, relentless march. You're not sprinting toward glory, you're trudging toward a meat grinder. A mainstream historical fact is that infantry squares and shield walls were incredibly effective at holding ground and repelling cavalry. These formations were the backbone of medieval armies, a disciplined, brutal block of men. Your strength isn't in your individual prowess, but in your ability to hold your ground with the men on either side of you. You can hear the enemy's own foot soldiers shuffling forward to meet you. A sound of heavy boots and muttered curses that's both a mirror of your own and a portent of things to come. You can't see their faces, just a wall of shields and glinting spear tips. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval armies would intentionally mix seasoned veterans with fresh recruits in the front ranks. The veterans' experience and calm would help steady the younger soldiers, and the rookies' raw energy could give the line a ferocious, if chaotic, edge. Historians still argue whether this was a standard practice or a risky gamble that could just as easily lead to a panicked rout. You find yourself hoping you're standing next to a veteran, but you also realize that everyone probably thinks the same thing. You check your grip on your spear one last time, your knuckles white against the wood. The space between your two armies is shrinking with agonizing slowness. You can now make out individual details on the enemy's side, the worn paint on a shield, a tear in a tunic, the grim determination on a face staring back at you. This isn't a fight for a king or a cause, it's a fight against the men in front of you. You are both equally terrified, equally tired, and equally here because you have no other choice. This is the truth of the infantryman's life. The glamour belongs to the knights on horseback. The glory belongs to the commanders who will write the history. Your role is simply to hold the line, to push forward, and to try to survive. The air crackles with a tension so thick you could almost grab it. The distance between the two walls of men is now just a few dozen paces, and 1,000 tiny moments of 1,000 lives are about to collide in a single, brutal instant. You take a deep breath, steeling yourself for the inevitable. The sound of metal on metal is coming, and it's coming fast. The gap between the two forces has all but disappeared. The air is no longer just tense, it's a living, humming wall of anticipation. You can hear the individual sounds now, a grunt of effort, the rasp of a breath, the clink of metal on metal as men jostle for position. You are armed with a spear, a simple, unadorned length of wood with a steel point. You might have dreamed of wielding a finely crafted sword, but a mainstream historical fact is that the humble spear was the weapon of choice for the vast majority of foot soldiers. They were cheap to produce, easy to use with minimal training, and devastatingly effective in a tight formation. The long reach of the spear allowed you to strike at an enemy without getting too close, keeping them at bay and protecting your front line. It's the ultimate tool for a mass of men fighting as one. The sword, that symbol of knightly valor, was actually a secondary weapon for most soldiers, a last resort if their spear was broken or lost. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval chroniclers often wrote about legendary swords, giving them names and a sense of personality, but they rarely, if ever, bothered to mention the spear. For them, a sword was a noble instrument of heroism, while a spear was just a tool for the common grunt. Historians still argue whether this romanticization of the sword skewed the historical record, making us underestimate the true importance of the simpler, more effective weapons. You realize, gripping the wood of your spear, that this is the truth of it. This isn't a story of brave knights and shining blades, it's a story of 1,000 men with spears, facing 1,000 other men with spears. The first impact is not a grand clash but a series of brutal, jarring collisions. The two walls of shields slam into each other with a sickening thud. The world shrinks to a small, chaotic bubble of struggling bodies. You push with your shield, leaning into the man next to you for support, and brace yourself for the counter-push. You can feel the combined weight of the enemy line pressing against yours. You thrust your spear forward, not aiming for a specific person, but just into the mass of bodies in front of you. You hear a grunt, a scream, and then you're pulling it back, the wood slick in your hand. This is not the clean, elegant fighting you read about. It's a messy, brutal, and horrifying scrum. The sounds are a cacophony of shouts, grunts, the scrape of steel on leather, and the horrifying, wet sound of a spear finding its mark. You're just one small part of this giant, violent push and pull. Your job is to keep pushing, to keep your spear forward, and to keep the man next to you from falling. The battle is just beginning, and already the ground is becoming slick. The front lines of the infantry are locked in a slow, agonizing grind, pushing, pulling, grunting. The sounds are a symphony of misery. But then, a new sound begins to cut through the din. A terrifying, rhythmic thrum from the flanks. It's the sound of a volley of arrows, a sound like 1,000 angry wasps. You see them arching through the air, a dark cloud against the sky. Before they descend upon the enemy's formation, you hear a collective scream of pain and surprise from the other side, and a brief, but crucial, ripple of disarray runs through their ranks. This is the power of the longbow, and you're grateful it's on your side. A mainstream historical fact is that the English longbow was a game-changer in medieval warfare, a weapon of such power and range that it could rain down death on enemy formations from a safe distance. It wasn't just a handful of arrows, a skilled archer could loose up to 12 shots a minute. This was a terrifying deluge of projectiles, and it could break a charge or soften an infantry line before the two forces even met. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the sheer physical strength required to pull a longbow was immense. The draw weight was often over 100 pounds, so archers developed a distinctive skeletal deformity. The bones of their arms and shoulders would actually grow larger and denser from the constant strain. It was a sign of their trade, a physical mark of their unique skill set. Historians still argue whether this deformity was a badge of honor or a debilitating condition that led to chronic pain later in life. You can just imagine the hand cramps alone. You push forward, your spear aimed at a gap in the enemy's shield wall. And another volley of arrows flies overhead. This time, you can feel the wind of them passing. The sound is different when you're on the receiving end. It's a high-pitched whistle of death. You hear a cry from the man to your left. He's hit. The enemy line, however, is starting to falter. The arrows are doing their job, creating chaos and forcing their formation to lose its cohesion. You see a man drop his shield to pull an arrow out of his thigh, and another, and then another. The sight is an encouragement to you. The longbowmen, unseen and 100 yards away, are your silent partners in this brutal dance. They don't face the enemy hand to hand, but their effect on the morale and discipline of the other side is devastating. You push harder now. Seeing a chance, the tide is turning, not because of a heroic charge or a glorious duel, but because of a quiet, unseen rain of deadly wood and steel. The longbow isn't glamorous, but it is brutally effective, and right now, you couldn't be more thankful for it. The grinding push forward becomes a little easier as the enemy's line wavers. The longbowmen are still doing their terrifying work, their volleys like a metronome of death in the background. But as you continue to push forward, you catch sight of the enemy's own ranged weapon contingent. They're not using longbows, they're using crossbows. These weapons look clunkier and slower, but no less deadly. A mainstream historical fact is that the crossbow was, in many ways, the technological rival of the longbow. While it lacked the rapid-fire capability, it compensated with raw power. A crossbow bolt could punch through chainmail or even plate armor at close range, something a longbow arrow struggled to do. A recruit with minimal training could operate a crossbow, whereas a longbowman was a highly specialized, years-in-the-making professional. It was the difference between a high-tech laser cannon and a machine gun. One was powerful and precise, the other was a rain of destruction. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the crossbow was considered so deadly and unchivalrous that the Second Lateran Council in 1139 banned its use against other Christians. Of course, this didn't stop anyone from using them, and the ban was widely ignored, proving once again that a good idea with a high body count is often hard to stop. Historians still argue whether this ban was a genuine moral objection to the weapon's power or a clever political move by the noble class to protect itself from being easily killed by peasant soldiers. You push on, watching a crossbowman on the enemy's side reload his weapon. The process is slow and laborious. He has to use a crank or a lever to pull the incredibly strong string back into place. You see him aim carefully, taking a long moment to pick his target. You hear the sharp thwack as he releases the bolt, and a man to your right goes down with a shriek. The longbow is a force of chaos. The crossbow is a sniper's tool. You're now close enough to the enemy line to see the chaos the arrows have wrought. There are gaps in their formation, men pulling out shafts, and a general air of confusion. This is the moment your commander has been waiting for. The sergeant next to you bellows, "Push now," and you find a reserve of strength you didn't know you had. Your shield wall surges forward, and you press into the wavering enemy line with renewed vigor. The crossbowmen are now too close to be effective, and they're scrambling to get out of the way. The archers, for all their speed, are still too far back to do much good in this close-quarters scrum. You realize that no single weapon wins a battle. It's the combination of them, used at the right time, that brings victory. This thought provides a fleeting moment of clarity in the midst of the chaos. A brief glimpse of the strategic chessboard beneath the blood and mud. The fighting intensifies, and you forget about the archers and the crossbowmen. Your world is now just the man in front of you. The infantry scrum has reached a brutal, chaotic equilibrium. The push and pull of the shield walls is a tiring, terrifying cycle. But then, a new kind of terror enters the equation. A collective groan rises from your ranks as a new threat appears on the horizon. This isn't a head-on clash. This is something far more drawn-out and insidious. You're looking at the beginning of a siege. A mainstream historical fact is that most medieval conflicts weren't decided on open fields like this. They were long, Protracted sieges of castles and walled cities, a grueling game of patience, starvation, and overwhelming force. Forget the glamour of a knight charging the gates. This is a game of logistics and psychological warfare. You are now a part of the siege force. You're not fighting an army in the field, but a wall. The enemy is behind those towering stone ramparts. Seemingly untouchable, your job is to make them touchable. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that siege warfare was so common that armies often had dedicated sappers, specialists who dug tunnels under the castle walls to weaken their foundations. This was a terrifying job, as the tunnels could collapse at any moment, but a successful sapping could bring down an entire section of the wall, creating a breach for the troops to pour through. Historians still argue whether the danger of sapping was more a physical risk from collapse or a psychological one from being trapped underground with the enemy possibly digging to meet you. You can see the defenders on the walls, tiny figures taunting you from a safe distance. They're firing down arrows, but most fall harmlessly short. You, in turn, can only stare at the stone walls, an unyielding barrier that feels almost alive. The real work of a siege isn't in a single, glorious assault, but in the mundane, day-to-day grind. It's the building of siege towers, the constructing of earthworks, and the setting up of trebuchets. This is a slow-motion battle, a war of attrition. You are here for the long haul. The days will blur together, filled with the back-breaking work of digging trenches, chopping wood, and trying to stay warm and dry. The enemy's occasional sorties from the gates are the only breaks in the monotony. Brief, brutal clashes that feel like a release of built-up tension. This is a different kind of horror. Not the sharp shock of battle, but the dull, grinding weight of waiting for months on end. You're not fighting an army, you're fighting a fortress. And the biggest weapon in its arsenal is time. You just hope your commander has enough food to outlast theirs, and that you don't all get sick from the contaminated water. The siege grinds on, day after day. You are a witness to the slow, methodical horror of attrition. But as you stare up at the castle walls, you start to see them not as just a giant stone barrier, but as a complex machine of control. A mainstream historical fact is that castles were not built just as defensive strongholds. Their primary purpose was to project a lord's power and authority over the surrounding lands. They were a statement of dominance, a visible reminder to the local population that this was the center of power. From the castle, a lord could collect taxes, dispense justice, and raise an army. It was a tool of governance and a symbol of feudal control. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that many castles had surprisingly elaborate and well-appointed living quarters, including things like latrines that flushed into moats and kitchens with complex ventilation systems. The point wasn't to live in squalor, it was to live in a fortified, luxurious home. The grand banquet halls and private chambers were as much a part of the castle's purpose as the arrow slits and crenellations. Historians still argue whether the comfort of the lord's chambers was a reflection of the wealth they extracted from the peasants, or a necessary means to keep a powerful noble happy and in control. You can see why a lord would want to protect that. You can now see the siege engines being constructed behind you. Massive, awkward-looking wooden contraptions that are slowly taking shape. This is a game of engineering as much as it is a game of war. The defenders on the wall seem to understand this too, occasionally sending out small raiding parties to try and sabotage the construction. These are brutal, messy affairs, far from the clean lines of a pitched battle. You're not fighting for a decisive victory, but for a slow, crushing defeat of the enemy's will. You spend your days not fighting, but doing hard labor, carrying stones and logs, digging trenches, and watching. This is a battle of who will give in first. Will the defenders starve? Will their morale break? Will your own food supplies last long enough to make it matter? The castle is not just a building, it is the enemy itself, a silent, unyielding foe that seems to mock your every effort. You are a small, insignificant part of a very big, very boring war. You just hope that when the time comes to finally assault the walls, you're not in the front of the line. The siege continues, a monotonous, grueling existence punctuated only by the distant thud of a rock hitting stone. But now, the siege engines are complete, and you can truly appreciate their terrifying, brutal simplicity. The first is a trebuchet, a massive, counterweighted sling that looks like a giant, Angry seesaw. A mainstream historical fact is that the trebuchet was one of the most powerful siege weapons ever devised, capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over immense distances. Its power came from a simple physics principle: a massive counterweight, often weighing many tons, would drop and launch the projectile with incredible force and accuracy. The whole thing was a beautiful, terrifying exercise in applied physics. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that besides hurling rocks, trebuchets were sometimes used for psychological warfare. They would launch diseased animal carcasses or human remains over the castle walls, hoping to spread sickness and break the morale of the defenders. It was a germ warfare tactic that, while likely not as effective as they hoped, certainly made a point. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or a particularly gruesome exception. You watch as a team of men uses a winch to slowly lower the arm of the trebuchet. The strain evident on their faces, the counterweight is lifted high into the air, and then, with a thunderous crash, it's released. The stone flies through the air, a whistling blur of death, and slams into the castle wall with a sound like a clap of thunder. A shower of dust and stone chips falls, but the wall still stands. It's a battle of wills between rock and stone. The second siege engine you see is a mangonel. It's smaller, more like a giant slingshot or catapult, using torsion from twisted ropes to launch its projectiles, while not as powerful or as long-ranged as a trebuchet. A mainstream historical fact is that the mangonel was a versatile and faster-firing machine, often used for more precise shots against specific targets on the wall, like a gatehouse or a defensive tower. You watch as a mangonel launches a smaller stone, which arcs through the air and smashes directly into a battlement, sending a defender scrambling for cover. These weapons aren't just about breaking down walls, they're about slowly, inexorably, grinding the defenders into submission. You can see the hopelessness on the faces of the men on the wall. They are trapped, and you are here, with these giant, patient machines, to remind them of that fact every single day. The siege is no longer a slow grind, it's now a loud, terrifying countdown, with each thud of a thrown rock marking another second closer to the final assault. The trebuchets and mangonels are a symphony of destruction, a relentless battering of stone against stone. But you are about to discover that brute force is not the only, or even the most effective, weapon in a siege. A mainstream historical fact is that siege warfare was as much a psychological game as a physical one. Commanders would employ feints and deceptions to confuse and demoralize the defenders. They might pretend to assault one gate with a small force, drawing defenders away from the true point of attack, or stage a loud, fake attack at night to keep the defenders awake and on edge. The goal wasn't just to break the walls, it was to break the will of the men inside them. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that attackers sometimes used false banners or false flags from allied or neutral parties to confuse the enemy into thinking that reinforcements had arrived, or that they were attacking the wrong place. This was a clever bit of deception, and while it rarely won the day on its own, it could sow enough confusion to give the attackers a crucial edge. Historians still argue whether this was considered an honorable tactic in a time of war or a clever ruse. You see a small group of your comrades running towards the main gate with scaling ladders, yelling and waving their swords. You know they don't have enough men to actually take the gate, but the defenders on the wall seem to fall for it, rushing to the gate to prepare for the assault. This momentary distraction gives the sappers, the men digging under the wall, a few more precious, undisturbed minutes. The air is filled with the constant thud of rocks and the occasional crash of a piece of masonry falling from the wall. You look up at the defenders, and you can see their faces now, a mixture of fatigue and fear. They've been under siege for weeks, maybe months. Their food is dwindling. They're running on fumes and hope. And you are a part of a patient, terrifying machine designed to extinguish both. This isn't a brave battle. It's a slow, methodical torment. The fear isn't of a spear thrust in the face, but of the slow, creeping dread of starvation and exhaustion. The taunts from the wall have become less frequent and less spirited. They know they're doomed, and you know it too. The final assault is inevitable, but before it comes, your commander is using every psychological trick in the book to weaken them. This is the unglamorous side of war, a waiting game where the real battle is not with swords, but with minds. You stand there, a small part of a much bigger drama, and you can almost feel the walls of their resolve starting to crack. The siege has a rhythm now, a slow, brutal beat of hunger and boredom. You are no longer focused on the distant walls but on the more immediate concerns of your army. You are now trudging alongside the baggage train, a long, winding line of wagons, pack animals, and weary labourers that stretches for miles behind the main force. A mainstream historical fact is that the baggage train was an army's most critical and vulnerable asset. It carried all the food, water, medical supplies, siege equipment, and spare weapons. Without it, an army couldn't last more than a few days. It was the lifeblood of the entire operation, and it was a logistical nightmare to keep it moving. You see the sheer scale of it now, wagons piled high with barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, and casks of ale. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the baggage train was also where you'd find a surprising number of non-combatants. From prostitutes and merchants to cooks and blacksmiths, these camp followers were an essential, if chaotic, part of the army, providing services that the soldiers themselves couldn't. Historians still argue whether the chaos of the baggage train was a necessary evil for a long campaign or a constant source of indiscipline and distraction for the fighting men. You can hear the groans of the wagon wheels, the curses of the drivers, and the lowing of the oxen. This is the unromantic underbelly of warfare. This is what makes the whole thing possible. You're a part of the rear guard, a small force tasked with protecting this slow-moving line from enemy raids. It's a tedious, nerve-wracking job. The boredom is broken by the constant fear of a sudden attack from a small, fast-moving force of enemy horsemen. You see a few knights riding back and forth, patrolling the flanks, their shiny armor a stark contrast to the muddy, unglamorous work of the baggage handlers. You realize that a battle isn't just a clash of two armies on a field. It's a complex, multi-layered operation, and the victory or defeat is often decided by the small things, like whether your food wagons arrive on time. You look at a barrel of ale being rolled off a wagon and remember how dry and thirsty you've been lately. It's a brief, mundane thought, but in this moment, it feels more important than any question of honor or glory. Your life, and the life of everyone in this army, depends on this long, messy line of wagons. You just hope no one has any bright ideas about setting a few of them on fire. The baggage train is a distant, mundane worry. Now, you're back on the battlefield, and your attention is drawn to the gleaming spectacle of the knights. They are the rock stars of this era, the focal point of every charge and every tale. Their armor, a shimmering, complex puzzle of steel plates, looks impenetrable. A mainstream historical fact is that a full suit of plate armor from the later Middle Ages, while heavy, was surprisingly flexible. It was designed to distribute weight evenly across the body, and the plates were jointed to allow for a full range of motion. A knight in plate armor could run, jump, and even get back up from a fall. The average weight of a full suit of plate armor was around 45 to 55 pounds, much less than the hundreds of pounds you might have heard about in movies. It was heavy. Yes, but it wasn't a prison. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that knights would often wear elaborate and colourful surcoats over their armour, not just for identification, but also to help with heat. The white or light-coloured cloth would reflect the sun, helping to prevent the knight from overheating inside his steel shell. Without it, you'd be a roasted chicken in a can. Historians still argue whether this was a primary function of the surcoat or just a happy side effect. You watch a knight dismount from his horse to check his girth strap, and he moves with a surprising fluid grace. He isn't a lumbering automaton, he's a highly trained athlete in a mobile, personal fortress. The armor is a testament to the high cost of war and the value of the man wearing it. A single suit could cost as much as a small farm, but for all its protection and flexibility, plate armor was not perfect. It still had weak points, the joints, the visor, the gaps where plates met. You realize that a battle isn't about one man being invincible, it's about finding those tiny, fatal chinks in the armor. You watch as a few of your fellow foot soldiers are tasked with holding the flanks of the knightly charge. They're not there to fight the knights directly, they're there to deal with any cavalry that gets dismounted or horses that get spooked. You realize that for all their glory, the knights are just another part of the machine, a very expensive, very shiny part, but a part nonetheless. You, the foot soldier, are the one who has to get your hands dirty, to get into the brutal, chaotic, and decidedly unglamorous part of the battle. You feel a pang of resentment, but also a sense of grim satisfaction. You might not have the fancy armor, but you have the numbers, and in this brutal world, that's often what matters most. The knights on their magnificent steeds are still a formidable sight, but you are now starting to understand the complex support system that allows them to do what they do. You see a younger man, not much more than a boy, running alongside a knight, holding his spare lance and shield. This is the squire. A mainstream historical fact is that squires were not just personal servants, they were apprentices in the brutal art of knighthood. They were often noble-born themselves, learning the ropes of warfare, chivalry, and command by shadowing a more experienced knight. Their duties ranged from polishing armor and tending to the horses to, in the heat of battle, bringing a fresh weapon or helping their master remount his horse. They were the crucial support staff. The roadies for the rock stars of the battlefield. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that squires were often expected to carry their master's shield. This wasn't just to lighten the load, it was a way for the squire to show off his master's heraldry, his coat of arms, to the entire army, a kind of walking, personalized billboard. This also meant that if a knight's shield was damaged, his squire was ready with a fresh one. Historians still argue whether the squire's role was a purely practical necessity or a deeply ingrained part of the knightly culture and its emphasis on honor and display. You watch as a squire sprints back to his master with a new lance, a look of fierce determination on his face. This isn't a servant's work, it's a vital, high-stakes job. The boy is just as much in danger as the knight, but his death would not merit a song or a story. You, a common foot soldier, look at the squire and feel a flicker of kinship. You're both here to do a job, a hard, thankless one. You are both just cogs in the war machine, but you also realize the vast social chasm between you. The squire is on a path to power and status. He will one day be a knight, a man who commands and owns land. You will probably go home to your farm, if you go home at all, and be thankful you survived. The knights and their squires are living in a different world from you, a world of honor, glory, and noble causes. Your world is one of mud, blood, and the simple desire to make it through another day. The boy catches your eye for a moment as he runs past, and you see the nervous energy and the fierce ambition in his eyes. He is a boy on the cusp of manhood, and you're just a man hoping to live to be an old man. You hope he makes it. You're back on the open field now. The siege, a distant, grinding memory. The air is tense with a new kind of waiting, a lull before another skirmish. Your mind wanders back to the archers. They are the silent, deadly part of the army, a kind of dark art you only get to witness from a distance. The longbowman, that quiet professional, is a living, breathing testament to the immense physical toll of his trade. A mainstream historical fact is that English longbowmen began their training in childhood, spending years, even decades, building the specific muscle groups needed to draw and loose their powerful bows. The average draw weight was so great that it was often compared to lifting a sack of flour with a single finger. The strength required was immense, and it was a skill that took a lifetime to perfect. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that longbowmen would often grow a large callus on their thumb, index, and middle fingers of their drawing hand. This callus, known as a bowman's callus, was a visible mark of their profession and their incredible strength. It was a badge of honor and a sign of their dedication. You're rubbing your own fingers together and can't imagine the pain it would take to build up such a thing. Historians still argue whether the physical strain of being a longbowman led to a high rate of retirement, or if the men were so well fed and taken care of by their lords that they could endure it. You look at a man in the archers' ranks, his bow unstrung and slung over his shoulder, and you can see the muscular bulk of his arms and shoulders, a testament to a lifetime of brutal, repetitive motion. The archers aren't just a force multiplier, they are a psychological weapon. They can stand a few hundred yards away and rain down death, without ever having to get their hands dirty in the melee. This is a very different kind of bravery. Not the wild, adrenaline-fueled charge, but a calm, methodical, and deadly efficiency. They're the cold-blooded assassins of the battlefield. The thought brings a different kind of respect. While you and your fellow foot soldiers are locked in a brutal, personal struggle, the archers are killing from a distance, a kind of detached, anonymous slaughter. You hear the faint sound of them stringing their bows, A series of short, sharp snaps that sends a shiver down your spine. The next volley is coming, and you know, with a grim certainty, that it will be just as deadly as the last. This is a battle of different skill sets and different kinds of courage. And the archers, with their quiet, deadly patience, are a crucial part of the victory. The fighting continues. A grinding, brutal dance of chaos and steel. You see a man fall. A scream ripped from his throat as a spear finds a home in his leg. His comrades ignore him. They can't stop to help. This is the moment you realize the horror of battlefield medicine. A mainstream historical fact is that medical care on the battlefield was shockingly primitive and almost non-existent. The vast majority of injuries were caused by blunt force trauma or puncture wounds from spears, arrows, and swords. A simple cut could become infected and kill you within days. The men who provided medical care were not doctors in the modern sense, but surgeons, barbers, or even laymen with a passing knowledge of herbs and a steady hand. Their primary tools were saws for amputation and cautery irons to stop bleeding. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that surgeons often use spiderwebs, mouldy bread, or even a mixture of wine and vinegar to clean wounds, unaware that these concoctions sometimes contained natural antibacterial agents. While they didn't know the science behind it, these desperate measures could sometimes save a life. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these folk remedies was due to genuine medicinal properties or just sheer luck. You watch as a man, his arm clearly broken, is dragged to the rear. There's no ambulance, no aid station. He'll be lucky if a barber surgeon is nearby and has a clean sore. More likely, he'll be left to the mercies of his comrades, who will do what they can, which is probably nothing. The air is thick with the groans of the wounded, a background noise that you try to block out. You know that if you fall, your fate is sealed. A quick death is a blessing. A slow one, bleeding out on the cold ground, is a curse. There is no one to carry you off, no one to give you a painkiller. You just have to endure until your body gives out. The medical reality of the battlefield is far more terrifying than the physical combat. The thought of a long, painful death from a relatively minor wound is a fear that gnaws at you more than the fear of a quick, clean kill. You push that thought out of your head and focus on the fight. You can't afford to be distracted. A spear thrust from the side and a minor injury could be the end of you, not from the point itself, but from what comes after. You press on, hoping that any injury you sustain is fatal and swift. The fighting grinds on, a brutal, chaotic mass of pushing, thrusting, and grunting. In the middle of all this confusion, you suddenly see a small bit of order, high above the chaos. A banner, a piece of cloth with an ornate symbol, is held aloft by a man on a horse. A mainstream historical fact is that banners and flags were absolutely vital on the medieval battlefield. They were a visual command and control system in an age before radios and walkie-talkies. The banner served as a rallying point, a marker for the soldiers to know where their commander was and what direction their unit was moving. If a banner fell, it was a signal that the commander was either dead or in retreat, and it could cause a chain reaction of panic and desertion. You, the foot soldier, might not know your commander by sight, but you know his banner. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some banners were so important that they were given names, and their bearers were highly paid professionals, even revered. The most famous banners in history, like the Oriflamme of France or the Raven Banner of the Vikings, were not just symbols. They were living, breathing objects of inspiration and fear. They were often believed to have a special, almost magical power. Historians still argue whether the importance of the banner was more a practical necessity for battlefield communication or a powerful psychological symbol that inspired men to fight beyond their limits. You look at your own unit's flag, a small, worn piece of cloth on a pole. It's not as grand as the commander's banner, but it's yours. It's a point of reference, a small, familiar anchor in a world that is becoming more and more disorienting. You push forward, your eyes darting from the enemy in front of you to the small banner above you. It's still there, still held high. You can hear a cheer from a few ranks back. Their banner is still up. You find a new surge of strength. You realize that your small, personal fight is part of a much bigger effort, all coordinated by the simple act of a flag being held high. It's a testament to the power of symbolism. The enemy's banner, you notice, is starting to lean. A few of their men are wavering, looking for an escape route. The psychological effect of a wavering banner is palpable. It signals weakness. It signals a loss of will. It's not just a battle of steel and muscle. It's a battle of resolve. You push harder now, seeing your chance. All because a piece of cloth is still flying high. The fight is an assault on your senses. The sight of the banner, the glint of steel, the mud and the blood, it's all overwhelming. But what truly defines this moment is the sound. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval battlefield was an auditory hellscape, a cacophony of disorienting, terrifying noises. There was the constant, low roar of men shouting, the sharp metallic ring of a sword on a helmet, the sickening thud of a weapon finding flesh, the screams of the wounded, and the triumphant bellows of the victors. The sound was not a simple roar, it was a complex, multi-layered noise that could be used for tactical advantage. The psychological effect of the noise was as important as the physical fighting. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some armies, particularly the Vikings, used special, intimidating musical instruments like war horns or drums to create a terrifying soundscape, hoping to unnerve their opponents before a single blow was struck. This was a form of psychological warfare, a way to make the enemy feel as if they were facing not just men, but monsters. Historians still argue whether the war horns were primarily for signaling or for terrorizing the enemy. You are in the middle of it now. You hear a spear shaft snap somewhere to your right. You hear a man cry out in pain, and another one laugh with a kind of wild, manic glee. The sound is a constant, overwhelming presence, a deafening noise that makes it hard to think, hard to hear your commander, and hard to focus on anything but the immediate threat in front of you. The sound of the battle is also a crucial part of the fight for the men fighting it. It's a way of knowing what's happening without being able to see. You hear a sudden cheer and a rush of movement to your left, and you know that part of your line is pushing forward. You hear a sudden scream of fear from the enemy, and you know they're wavering. The sound is a constant stream of information, but it's also a way to get lost. The sheer volume of noise can be disorienting, a constant, ringing presence that makes you feel as if you are fighting in a dream. You push forward, your ears ringing, your own shouts lost in the noise. The sound of the battle is a living thing, a hungry beast, and you are trapped inside its stomach. You just hope you make it out before it digests you. The chaos and noise are all consuming, a tidal wave of sensory overload. The ground beneath your boots is not a flat, pristine field from a painting. It's an obstacle course of ruts, divots, and muddy patches, and as the fighting intensifies, you begin to see how the very earth you stand on is a weapon. A mainstream historical fact is that terrain was perhaps the single most important factor in a medieval battle. A slight rise, a muddy stream, a clump of trees, or even a hidden ditch could decide the fate of an entire army. A commander who understood the ground could use it to his advantage, forcing the enemy to fight on unfavorable turf. Conversely, a commander who ignored the terrain was a commander who was marching his men to their deaths. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some clever commanders would deliberately bait their opponents into fighting on soft ground. They might hide a boggy area with a thin layer of sod or set a trap of dug pits to trip up cavalry. These were often called bog fights or pothole battles. They were an unchivalrous but brutally effective way to neutralize the enemy's most powerful assets. Historians still argue whether this was a common tactic in medieval warfare or a rare, particularly clever trick that was only employed by a few cunning generals. You see a few of your fellow soldiers slip in a patch of mud and have to scramble to regain their footing, their armor clanking loudly. This isn't a simple fight, it's a constant battle against the ground itself. You look to your left and see the cavalry, that magnificent, shining force, struggling to maintain a cohesive line as they navigate a slight, almost imperceptible dip in the ground. The terrain is breaking up their formation, making them less effective. The knights are a symbol of power, but the ground is the reality. This isn't a fight of brute strength, it's a fight of logistics and careful positioning. You realize your commander was very smart to position you here, on the higher, drier ground. You have the advantage. The enemy has to fight an uphill battle. This gives you a crucial edge, a slight but important boost in momentum. The sound of the battle is deafening, but you can still hear the frustration in the shouts of the enemy as they struggle with the mud and the uneven ground. The terrain is on your side, and you feel a small, welcome surge of confidence. The ground is your silent ally. and it's doing more damage to the enemy's formation than a dozen men with swords. You push forward, knowing that every step is a step towards victory, all thanks to the humble, unglamorous dirt beneath your feet. The terrain, your silent ally, has done its work. The enemy's formation is a little ragged, a little less disciplined than it was just moments ago. This is the moment for which you've trained. The first contact, a brutal, horrifying collision of two shield walls, is over. Now, it's about the opening moves, the slow, agonizing push that decides the rest of the battle. Your commander's order is simple: advance. A mainstream historical fact is that the opening of a medieval battle was rarely a wild, free-for-all charge. It was a methodical, disciplined advance of infantry, a slow-motion push of human bodies and shields. The goal was to maintain formation, to keep your shield locked with the man next to you, and to avoid any gaps that the enemy could exploit. It was a test of will and stamina. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some armies would have a designated front ranker who was often a massive, powerful man whose sole job was to absorb the initial impact and keep the line from breaking. He was essentially a human battering ram. These men were often paid a bonus for their horrifying job. Historians still argue whether the front ranker was a crucial part of the infantry formation or just a myth born of the romantic idea of a single, powerful warrior. You look at the man in front of you, a hulking brute with a heavy axe. He's taking the brunt of the blows, his shield dented and scarred, but he's holding the line. You're grateful he's there. The two lines of men are now a single, churning mass of humanity. You can hear the rhythmic grunting of the push and pull, the scrape of steel on leather, and the soft, sickening sound of a spear finding its mark. The world has shrunk to a small, suffocating bubble of blood, sweat, and fear. You push with your shield, leaning into the weight of the men behind you, and thrust with your spear. This is not a heroic duel, it's a brutal, impersonal job. You don't know the name of the man you're fighting, and he doesn't know yours. You are just two bodies in a mass of hundreds, locked in a struggle for a few inches of ground. The advance is slow, agonizingly so. Every step forward feels like a small victory, a testament to your endurance and your will to live. The opening moves of the battle aren't about glory, they're about survival. And right now, you're just trying to survive. You feel a sudden push from the men behind you, and your line lurches forward. You're gaining ground, the enemy is giving way. You push harder, the advance is working, the enemy line is wavering, and you feel a rush of adrenaline. But then, it happens. The two forces, no longer a slow-moving, methodical advance, smash into each other with a brutal, disorienting shock. It's not a gentle push, it's a sudden, horrifying collision. A mainstream historical fact is that this first contact shock was often the most brutal and chaotic moment of a battle. The initial collision of two shield walls was a sensory overload of noise, pain, and confusion. It was in this moment that formations could break, and the battle could be won or lost in a matter of seconds. It's a moment of truth, where all the training and discipline either hold or fail. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some veteran soldiers developed a specific, almost animalistic grunt or scream they would use right before the impact. This sound, a kind of primal roar, was meant to unnerve the enemy and provide a last-second burst of adrenaline for themselves. Historians still argue whether this was a common, disciplined practice or just a spontaneous reaction to the fear of the moment. You feel the impact now. It's a full-body shock that travels from the soles of your boots to the top of your head. Your shield slams into the enemies with a bone-jarring thud. You feel a sudden surge of bodies pressing against you, and you have to dig your feet into the mud to keep from falling. The world shrinks to this tiny, violent bubble of struggling bodies. You can't see the big picture anymore. You can only see the man in front of you. Your spear is useless at this range. So you drop it and pull out your secondary weapon, a short knife. This is the hand-to-hand combat you always feared. The fear is no longer an abstract idea, it's a living, breathing presence next to you, a cold hand on your shoulder. The sounds are a cacophony of metal on metal, the groans of men, and the screams of pain. This is the moment where the rules of war break down, and it becomes a personal, desperate struggle for survival. You are no longer part of a disciplined unit. You are an individual fighting to stay alive. The first contact shock is over, and now you are in the thick of it. You just hope your luck holds out a little longer. The first contact shock is a lingering, horrifying memory. Now, in a brief and strange lull in the fighting, you notice something out of a storybook. Two knights, one from your side and one from the enemy's, have ridden forward. They are facing each other in the middle of the battlefield. This is a duel of champions. A mainstream historical fact is that battles were occasionally preceded or punctuated by these single combats, often between two noblemen. The idea was that the outcome of this duel would decide the outcome of the battle, saving thousands of lives. It was an attempt to make war more personal and to reintroduce a sense of chivalry to a brutal and messy business. You watch as the two knights, their armor gleaming in the sun, lower their lances and prepare to charge. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these duels weren't always to the death. Sometimes they were a kind of combat sport with specific rules designed to disarm the opponent without killing him. It was a kind of a high-stakes jousting match. Historians still argue whether these duels were ever truly decisive in winning a battle or if they were just a romantic gesture that rarely had any real strategic impact. You watch as the two knights charge. The sound of their horses' hooves a drumbeat on the muddy ground. They collide with a thunderous crash, lances splintering, and both riders are thrown from their horses. They get up, dazed, and begin to fight with their swords. A slow, methodical, and brutal dance. This is the stuff of legends. The kind of story that bards would sing about for years to come, but the reality is far more mundane. The battle has not stopped. The infantry behind you is still pushing forward, and the archers are still raining down arrows. This duel is a sideshow, a theatrical piece in the middle of a brutal, messy reality. The common soldiers, like you, don't stop fighting just because two rich guys are having a personal spat. This moment of chivalry is a brief, almost comical interlude in the midst of a horrifying slaughter. You push forward, your spear aimed at the man in front of you. You don't have the luxury of a personal duel. Your battle is not one of honor and glory, it is one of survival. The duel of champions is a beautiful, archaic dream, and you are the harsh, cold reality. The duel is almost over. One of the knights falls, his side lets out a groan, and your side lets out a cheer, but the fighting doesn't stop. You realize that a battle is won not by a single hero, but by 1,000 common men doing their dirty, unromantic jobs. The duel of champions is over. Your line is still pushing forward, your small unit still fighting, but you're about to witness a move that is far more decisive than any single duel. It's the flanking maneuver. A mainstream historical fact is that the flanking maneuver, an attack on the enemy's side or rear, was one of the most effective and deadly tactics in medieval warfare. An army that was attacked from the front could hold its ground, but an army that was attacked from the side, or worse, from the back, would quickly lose its cohesion and dissolve into chaos. It turned a controlled battle into a panicked slaughter. You watch as a small force of your commander's cavalry, unseen until now, rides around the enemy's main line and slams into their exposed flank. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some commanders would deliberately set up a false flank, a line of less experienced or lightly armored troops, to draw the enemy's cavalry into an ambush. It was a risky but clever way to protect their main force. Historians still argue whether this was a rare, genius-level tactic or just a common ruse. You see the chaos now. The enemy's line, once a disciplined wall, is now a swirling mass of individuals, trying to turn and face the new threat. Their formation is broken. They can't fight both threats at once. It's a kind of beautiful, terrifying dance of death. And you have a front-row seat, the enemy soldiers, who were just moments ago a terrifying, unyielding presence, are now scattering in every direction, running for their lives. Your commander shouts the order, and you, along with your fellow soldiers, rush into the newly created gap in the enemy's line. This is the moment of truth. You are no longer fighting, you are hunting. You are no longer defending, you are attacking. The enemy is in full rout, and the battle, for all intents and purposes, is over. The flanking maneuver didn't just win the day, it won the entire battle. It was a move of pure, brutal strategy, a testament to the fact that a war is won not just with strength, but with wits. You are running now, your short knife in your hand, a feeling of exhilaration mixed with a grim determination. The fear is gone. You are the predator. The enemy is in full retreat. It's a stampede of broken men and panicked horses, a swirling, a desperate mass. And now you see a grim truth about warfare. Retreat is often far more dangerous than fighting. A mainstream historical fact is that the majority of casualties in a medieval battle occurred during the rout. A disciplined, fighting army could hold its own, but a fleeing, disorganized mob was a slaughter waiting to happen. The men who turn their backs and run expose their most vulnerable points to the enemy, their backs, their necks, their legs. They are easy targets, and the pursuers, with their fear replaced by a kind of wild, manic glee, show no mercy. This is the brutal reality of the chase. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some commanders would train their men to run with their shields, a technique where they would turn their backs to the enemy but hold their shield at an angle to protect their exposed spine. This was a desperate, last-ditch effort at survival, and it rarely worked. Historians still argue whether this was a common, well-drilled maneuver or a myth perpetuated by those who survived. You are now a part of the chase, your tired legs finding a new reserve of energy. You see a man trip and fall, and before he can get up, he is swarmed by your comrades. The sound of the slaughter is sickening. It's not a fight, it's an execution. You realize that you are no longer a soldier fighting for a cause. You are a predator, a hunter. You are a part of a brutal, unthinking machine designed for one purpose, to kill. The fear of death has been replaced by the thrill of the hunt. This is a side of warfare you never wanted to see. A side that history books gloss over. The glory is in the fighting, the heroism is in the charge, but the truth is in the rout. You see men throwing off their armor and weapons to run faster, making themselves even more vulnerable. They are abandoning all pretense of being soldiers and are now just men trying to survive. Their lives measured in the few seconds it takes for a pursuing spear to find them. The sight is both terrifying and exhilarating. You just hope that if your side ever breaks, you are a fast runner, because the only thing worse than fighting is running. The rout is in full swing, and the field is a chaos of men either running or giving chase. But then, you see a strange, almost theatrical pause in the violence. A few of your fellow soldiers have surrounded a knight who has fallen from his horse. He is disarmed, but he is not being killed. He is being taken prisoner. A mainstream historical fact is that noblemen were often captured for ransom instead of being killed. A dead nobleman was worth nothing, but a living one could be worth a fortune. The ransom could include land, money, or political concessions. This was a gentleman's agreement, a kind of unwritten rule of warfare that applied only to the upper classes. You, a common soldier, were not worth a ransom. You were only worth the dirt you were standing on. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the process of taking a nobleman for ransom was a very specific and ritualized affair. The captor would have to announce his claim loudly, often calling out the name of the nobleman he was capturing, and then ensure the prisoner was taken to the rear and guarded. The process was so formalized that some contracts for mercenary companies included specific clauses for the distribution of ransom money. Historians still argue whether this was a moral decision based on the idea of chivalry or a purely economic one based on the high value of a nobleman's life. You watch as the captured knight is led away, his head bowed, his face a mask of shame and defeat. He is not a victim, he is a valuable asset. You, a common foot soldier, have no such luxury. If you are captured, you will be killed. You are worth nothing to the enemy. Your life has no economic value. This is the stark reality of the class system on the battlefield. The rich men fight for glory and money, and they have an escape hatch in the form of a ransom. You fight for your life, and your only escape is to win or to run faster than the man chasing you. The thought is a sobering one. It puts a grim, economic value on your existence. You look at the captured knight and feel a flicker of envy. He has a second chance. You don't. You push on. Your mind no longer on the glory of the win, but on the cold, hard fact of your own low worth. You are a tool of war, and a tool, once broken, is thrown away. The battle is over, the fighting has ceased, replaced by the grim, quiet aftermath. You are now standing on the battlefield, and it's a horrifying sight. The ground is a churned morass of mud, blood, and broken bodies. This is the aftermath of a skirmish, a moment that is rarely captured in the heroic tales. A mainstream historical fact is that the battlefield was a scene of chaos and looting after the fighting was done. The victors would fan out, searching for anything of value on the bodies of the dead and wounded. This was not a moral failing, it was a practical necessity. A good sword, a piece of armor, or a bag of coins could be the difference between a soldier's survival and his eventual poverty. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some veteran soldiers were so adept at this grim task that they could identify the wealth of a fallen enemy just by the quality of his boots or the material of his tunic. They were essentially battlefield forensic experts. Historians still argue whether this was a form of sanctioned salvage or a brutal, opportunistic free-for-all. You see a comrade bending over a dead enemy, carefully prying off his helmet. Another is cutting the laces of a man's boots to take them. The air is filled with the low hum of voices and the occasional curse as someone finds a wound that is still bleeding. The living and the dead are all a part of this quiet, horrifying dance. You, too, begin to walk the field, your eyes scanning the ground. You are not looking for a moral lesson. You are looking for a sword that's better than yours, a pair of boots that aren't falling apart, or a coin purse that might buy you a hot meal on the way home. This is the unromantic end of the battle. The glory is gone. The adrenaline is fading. All that is left is the grim reality of survival. The groans of the wounded are a constant background noise, a haunting reminder of the cost of this day. You find a discarded helmet and try it on. It's too big. You throw it back down. The ground is littered with the detritus of war, broken shields, bent spears, and torn banners. This is the truth of the battlefield. A truth that is far more haunting and human than any tale of honor or glory. You just hope that one of these bodies doesn't suddenly spring to life. The grim work of the aftermath is a constant reminder of the brutal economics of war. But as you walk among the dead and the dying, you notice a new kind of soldier among your ranks, the mercenaries. A mainstream historical fact is that mercenary companies were a common feature of medieval warfare. They were professional soldiers who fought not for a lord or a country, but for pay. They were often highly skilled, well-equipped, and fiercely disciplined, as their very survival depended on their reputation. They were, in essence, the private contractors of their day, and they were a lot more reliable than a conscripted peasant army. They were not bound by honor or loyalty, only by their contract. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that mercenary companies often had their own banners and unique insignia, which were sometimes more well-known and feared than those of the lords who hired them. These companies, like the famous Catalan Company or the White Company, were a force unto themselves, and they often dictated the terms of their employment. Historians still argue whether the use of mercenaries was a sign of a lord's political weakness or a clever strategic choice that allowed him to field a well-trained army without the long-term cost of a standing one. You see a few of them now, their armor a mishmash of different styles and origins, a testament to their long and varied careers. They are not celebrating the victory, they are simply collecting their due, their faces grim and professional. They are not fighting for glory, they are fighting for a paycheck. You look at a mercenary with a scarred face, his eyes hard and cold. He is not a man to be trifled with, he is a professional killer. The contrast between him and the common conscripted soldiers is stark. You, the foot soldier, are here out of a feudal duty. He is here because he has a contract. This is a cold, transactional reality, far removed from the romantic notions of chivalry and honor. The mercenary doesn't care about your cause or your king, he cares about the money, and he will fight as hard for your enemy tomorrow if the price is right. The thought is a sobering one. It makes you realize that in the grand scheme of things, your life has a very specific and very low monetary value, and the life of a mercenary is just a commodity to be bought and sold on the market of war. The grim work of the aftermath and the cold presence of the mercenaries are a stark reminder of the realities of war. But as you return to camp, you see an entirely different side of this whole operation, a side that is rarely mentioned in the history books. You are now surrounded by the camp followers. A mainstream historical fact is that a medieval army was never just a fighting force. It was a chaotic, mobile city, and it included a large number of non-combatants, merchants, blacksmiths, cooks, laundresses, and a variety of other people who followed the army to provide essential services. These camp followers were the unorganized, messy heart of the army's logistics and support system. Without them, the army would have starved, its weapons would have broken, and its men would have been sick and miserable. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these camp followers often had their own intricate social hierarchy and a kind of informal economy. There were merchants who sold everything from ale to trinkets, and cooks who would make meals for a small fee. This was a kind of proto-supply chain, a civilian support system for a military operation. Historians still argue whether the camp followers were a necessary and vital part of an army or a constant source of disease and indiscipline. You walk past a woman who is carefully mending a soldier's tunic, her face grim and tired. You see a man trying to sell a few bottles of watered-down wine, his voice low and hopeful. This is a very different kind of fight. It's a fight for a living, a daily struggle to survive on the fringes of a brutal conflict. The camp is a chaotic jumble of tents, wagons, and open fires. It smells of wood smoke, cheap ale, and unwashed bodies. You can hear the low murmur of conversations, the clatter of pots and pans, and the occasional burst of a man laughing or crying. This is the human side of the war, the side that is filled with all the mundane, day-to-day realities that the fighting itself tries to obscure. You are no longer a soldier on the battlefield, you are a customer in this sprawling, temporary city. You feel a pang of longing for a decent meal, for a bed that isn't made of cold, hard earth. The camp followers are a kind of mirror, a reflection of the outside world you left behind, and their presence makes you miss it more than you thought you would. They are a reminder that a war is not just about the fighting, it's about the living, and the living is often a lot harder than the dying. The camp is a chaotic jumble. But you are now back on the field, and a new kind of order is being established. This is the chain of command, a lifeline in the chaos of battle. A mainstream historical fact is that a medieval army's effectiveness relied on a clear, if often difficult, flow of information from the top to the bottom. The commander, often a king or a noble, would issue orders to his lieutenants. They, in turn, would relay those orders to their captains, and the captains would then shout them to the sergeants. The sergeants would then bark the commands at you, the common foot soldier. It was a verbal system that was often prone to error and a crucial part of an army's success or failure. You can see the frantic, silent ballet of men on horseback riding back and forth, carrying messages from one part of the army to another. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some commanders used hand signals or even specially trained dogs to carry messages across the battlefield. The dogs were a faster and more reliable way to get a short message from one unit to another without relying on a rider who could be easily killed. Historians still argue whether the use of messenger dogs was a common practice or a rare, innovative tactic. You, on the ground, are at the very bottom of this chain. You don't know the grand strategy. You don't know the plan. You only know the orders your sergeant screams at you, and you obey them without question. The orders you receive are simple. Push forward. They are not nuanced. They are not tactical. They are a kind of verbal hammer, a way to keep 1,000 men moving in the same direction. The beauty of the chain of command is its simplicity. The terror is its fragility. If a single link in the chain breaks, if a captain is killed and his men have no one to follow, the entire unit can fall into chaos. You watch as a group of men suddenly stops fighting and looks around, lost and confused. You realize their captain has fallen. It's a sobering sight. It reminds you that you are a part of a complex, living machine. You're not just a man with a spear, you're a part of a command structure that is a lot bigger than you are. You just hope your commander knows what he is doing, and you just hope the orders keep coming. The battle rages on, and you are a small, anonymous part of a massive conflict. This is the reality of the common soldier's life. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of men who fought in a medieval battle were not professional soldiers. They were conscripted peasants, pressed into service by their lord for a few weeks or months. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly paid. If they were paid at all, their lives were brutal, short, and often ended with no one to mourn them. They were the anonymous backbone of the army, the men who did the dying while the nobles did the fighting. You are one of them. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that many of these conscripts were so unaccustomed to military life that they would try to bring their farm animals with them to battle. This led to a very messy and chaotic march, with pigs, goats, and chickens often getting in the way. Historians still argue whether this was a common occurrence or a comical exaggeration from the chroniclers. You can just imagine a pig getting tangled up in your spear and ruining your aim at a crucial moment. The common soldier's life was a brutal one. It was a life of long marches, of poor food, of sleeping in the mud and the rain, and of facing a terrifying, violent death with no promise of reward or glory. You are fighting not for a noble cause, but for the simple hope that you will live to see your farm again. You look at the man next to you. He is a farmer from a nearby village. He has a wife and 2 small children. You can see the fear in his eyes. A fear that is a lot more real and a lot more human than the grand, abstract fear of death. He is not a hero. He is just a man trying to survive. This is the truth of the common soldier's life, a truth that is often lost in the grand narratives of history. You are not a figure in a song or a story. You are a living, breathing human being with a family and a life, and you are terrified. The thought is a sobering one. It makes the entire affair feel a lot more personal and a lot more sad. The fighting is a slow, methodical grind, but your spirit is being lifted by something other than the push of your comrades. It's the presence of a priest. A mainstream historical fact is that religion played a huge role in medieval warfare. Priests and monks were often a part of the army, offering prayers, hearing confessions, and giving last rites to the dying. They were a crucial source of psychological comfort and motivation. A soldier who believed he was fighting for God, and who believed he had a place in heaven, was a soldier who was willing to die. The priests were a spiritual backbone of the army, a way to make sense of the senseless violence and brutality. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some priests would carry special relics or holy objects onto the battlefield, believing that they would provide divine protection to the army. These relics, often a bone from a saint or a piece of the true cross, were a powerful symbol of faith and a source of hope in a hopeless situation. Historians still argue whether the priest's presence on the battlefield was a genuine source of spiritual strength or a cynical tool of manipulation used by the commanders to keep their men fighting. You see a priest now, a quiet figure in the chaos, walking among the men, offering a few whispered words of encouragement or a quick blessing. He is a source of calm in the storm. You find yourself saying a quiet prayer, a simple, heartfelt plea for survival. You are not a man of great faith, but here, on this battlefield, with death all around you, you find yourself believing in something bigger than yourself. The priest's presence is a comfort, a reminder that your life has a spiritual value beyond the cold, hard economics of war. It gives you a reason to fight, a reason to endure. The thought is a powerful one. It makes the whole affair feel a lot more meaningful and a lot less terrifying. You are not just a man with a spear, you are a man with a soul, and that, in this brutal world, is a powerful weapon. The battle grinds on, but the weather, a force more powerful than any army, is about to make its presence known. A mainstream historical fact is that weather was a major factor in medieval warfare. A sudden rainstorm could turn the battlefield into a muddy bog, making it impossible for cavalry to charge and for infantry to keep their footing. A sudden heat wave could lead to heat stroke and dehydration. A sudden cold snap could cause hypothermia and frostbite. An army was only as strong as its ability to withstand the elements. You feel the first few drops of rain now. A cold, chilling presence on your face. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some commanders would consult with astrologers or wise men before a battle, asking for a reading on the best day to fight based on the position of the stars and the expected weather. This was not just superstition, it was a desperate attempt to get any kind of edge in a world where so much was left to chance. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice among commanders or a last resort for those who felt they were losing control. The rain is now a steady downpour, and the ground is quickly turning into a slippery, viscous mess. You can feel your boots sinking into the mud, and your footing is becoming more and more precarious. The sound of the rain is a new, disorienting presence, a quiet drumbeat that is drowning out the sounds of the battle. The rain is a neutral party, a silent observer that is now a major player. The enemy is struggling just as much as you are. You can see a few men fall and disappear into the mud. The rain is turning the battlefield into a grave. You just hope you don't become one of them. The weather is a reminder that you are not in control, that you are a small, insignificant part of a much bigger, much more chaotic world. The rain is a leveler, a force that cares nothing for your cause or your honor. All it cares about is making you miserable. You just hope it stops before you drown in the mud. The rain is a cold, miserable reality. But something far more insidious is lurking in the army. It's disease. A mainstream historical fact is that in medieval campaigns, More soldiers died from disease and sickness than from battle wounds. Poor hygiene, contaminated water, and a lack of proper sanitation made the camps a breeding ground for a host of diseases. From dysentery and typhus to the common cold, an army was not just a fighting force, it was a mobile vector for pestilence. The constant marching and a close proximity of men, animals, and filth was a recipe for disaster. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some armies would bring along disease doctors, who were not trained in medicine but were expert in the use of herbs and folk remedies. They would often advise the commanders on where to set up camp to avoid contaminated water and bad air. Historians still argue whether these doctors were a genuine help or a dangerous distraction from the real problems of sanitation. You can see the effects of sickness now. Men are coughing, their faces pale and drawn. You hear a comrade groan in the middle of the night, racked with a fever. This is the silent killer, the enemy that is a lot more effective and a lot more terrifying than a sword or a spear. You realize that a battle is not just a fight against the enemy in front of you, it's a fight against the invisible enemy all around you. You are constantly on guard, not just against a stray arrow, but against a glass of bad water or a fever that could take you out of the fight without a single blow being struck. The fear of sickness is a constant, nagging presence, a low-grade anxiety that is always with you. The rain is still falling, turning the camp into a soupy mess, and you know that the conditions are perfect for an outbreak. You just hope that you are strong enough to fight off the sickness, because if you don't, you will die not with a sword in your hand, but with a fever in your bed. This is the unromantic, and far more terrifying, side of war. The rain and sickness are a constant worry, but the presence of your king, a figure of authority and power, is a powerful motivator. A mainstream historical fact is that a monarch's presence on the battlefield was a huge risk but also a powerful psychological boon. A king who fought alongside his men could inspire them to acts of incredible bravery and loyalty. He was a rallying point, a symbol of the entire nation's will to fight, but his death on the battlefield could mean the end of the dynasty and the collapse of the army. It was a high-stakes gamble, a testament to the king's bravery or his hubris. You catch a glimpse of him now, his armor shining, his banner held high, a beacon of hope in a sea of chaos. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some kings would have a royal double, a man who looked like the king and would dress in the same armor. His job was to draw the attention of the enemy's archers and assassins, acting as a decoy to keep the real king safe. Historians still argue whether the use of a royal double was a common practice or a myth, but you have to admit, it's a clever way to stay alive. You look at your king now, and you wonder if he is the real one or a double. You can't tell, and it doesn't really matter. His presence, real or not, is a powerful symbol of your cause. The king is a constant, reassuring presence. You know that he is here to win, and his presence makes you believe that a win is possible. He is the living embodiment of your cause, and you would gladly die for him. This is the power of the king, a power that is a lot more important than any sword or spear. You just hope that his presence doesn't get him killed, because if he falls, the battle is lost, and so is your home. The battle is a terrifying maelstrom, but something keeps you from running. Something keeps you fighting. It's courage. A mainstream historical fact is that courage on the battlefield was not a single, heroic act, but a complex mix of fear, duty, and sheer, bloody-minded determination. A man was not a hero because he was not afraid. He was a hero because he was afraid, and he fought anyway. It was a fight against his own instincts, against the primal urge to flee. The fear was a living presence, a cold hand on your heart, and courage was the willingness to push through it. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some soldiers would deliberately use an enemy's fear against them. They would use a particularly terrifying battle cry or a wild, manic laugh to unnerve their opponents and break their will to fight. It was a kind of psychological jujitsu, using the enemy's own fear against them. Historians still argue whether this was a common tactic or just an act of a few wild, unhinged men. You hear a man screaming now, a primal, guttural roar that is not a war cry but a release of fear and anger. It's a terrifying and inspiring sound at the same time. You realize that courage is not an absence of fear, it's a response to it. You are afraid, and that's okay. The man next to you is afraid, and that's okay too. Your shared fear is a kind of bond, a silent, unspoken acknowledgement of the horror of this moment. This is the psychology of courage, a complex and powerful force that keeps you fighting when all your instincts tell you to run. You push forward, your spear held high, your mind clear, and you realize that you are not just a man fighting, you are a man overcoming his fear, and that is a true act of bravery. The battle is a chaotic, disorienting mess, but something brings a sense of order to the field. It's heraldry. A mainstream historical fact is that heraldry, the art of creating and displaying coats of arms, was more than just a fancy decoration. It was a system of identification, a way to know who was who on the chaotic battlefield. A knight's coat of arms, displayed on his shield and surcoat, was his personal ID card. It was a way for his men to know who he was and for his enemies to know who they were fighting. It was a visual system of recognition in a world without names or faces. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the colours and symbols on a coat of arms were not just chosen at random. They often had a specific meaning. A lion meant courage, a fleur-de-lis meant purity, and a bend sinister. A diagonal stripe on the shield was often used to denote an illegitimate son. It was a complex, coded language that told a story about the man who wore it. Historians still argue whether the colours and symbols were a deeply personal choice or a standardized system of rules and regulations. You look at the coat of arms on a passing knight's shield, a lion rampant on a field of gold. You don't know the man, but you know his story. He is a brave man, a man of wealth and power. You, a common soldier, have no coat of arms. You are a man without a story, a face without a name, but you can read the symbols on the battlefield, and you know who is who. The heraldry is a kind of a cheat sheet, a way to know who to fight and who to avoid. It's a reminder that a battle is not just a free-for-all, it is a series of interconnected, personal struggles, all of which are laid bare on a man's shield. The heraldry is a beautiful, archaic dream, and you are the cold, hard reality. You are the man without a name, the man without a story. The fighting is a brutal grind, but a new, terrifying weapon is about to enter the fray. It's fire. A mainstream historical fact is that fire was used in medieval warfare not just to burn down buildings, but as a weapon of terror, flaming arrows, siege engines that hurled pots of Greek fire, and even men with torches could be used to sow chaos and fear among the enemy. Fire was a psychological weapon that was as effective as any sword or spear. It could burn down a town, but it could also break the will of an army. You see a few flaming arrows now, a terrifying streak of light against the sky, before they land with a hiss on a man's shield. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some armies would use special fire starters, men who were paid to set fire to enemy encampments and towns, a kind of medieval saboteur. These men were often feared and hated by both sides. Historians still argue whether the use of fire in a battle was a standard part of warfare or a kind of unchivalrous, last-ditch effort. You feel the heat now, a sudden, suffocating presence that is a lot more terrifying than the cold. The fire is a living, breathing thing, a hungry beast that is devouring everything in its path. You can hear the screams of men who have been caught in the flames, a horrible, gut-wrenching sound that is more terrifying than any battle cry. The fire is a new enemy, an enemy that cannot be fought with a sword or a spear. It's a force of nature, a terrifying and unpredictable presence that is turning the battlefield into a hellscape. You just hope it doesn't reach you. You see a man drop his shield and run, his face a mask of fear. He is not afraid of the enemy. He is afraid of the fire. The fire is a reminder that a battle is not just a fight against men. It's a fight against the very elements, a fight for survival in a world that is trying to burn you alive. The battle is a symphony of noise and chaos, but a new, quiet moment has arrived. It's the moment of surrender. A mainstream historical fact is that surrender in medieval warfare was a formalized, often unspoken, ritual. A man who wished to surrender would drop his weapon, kneel, and often throw his helmet to the side, exposing his head. He would often have a token to offer, like a glove or a ring, as a sign of his submission. It was a sign that he was no longer a combatant, but a prisoner. It was a fragile, unwritten rule that was often broken in the heat of a rout, but it was a rule nonetheless. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some armies would have a special surrender flag, a white banner that they would raise to signal their desire to surrender. This was a rare but sometimes effective way to end a battle without a full-scale slaughter. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or a kind of diplomatic fantasy that rarely worked. You see a man now, a knight, his armor dented and scarred, kneeling on the ground, his helmet thrown to the side. He is offering his sword to a man from your ranks. The man takes the sword, and the knight is now a prisoner. This is a quiet, powerful moment, a moment of dignity in a sea of brutality. It's a testament to the fact that even in the midst of a slaughter, there are rules. The man who is now a prisoner has a chance to live. He is no longer an enemy. He is a person. The thought is a sobering one. It makes you realize that a battle is not just about killing. It is about a complex, unwritten set of rules that are as important as any law of the land. You just hope that if your time comes, you can remember the ritual. The battle is over, the fighting has ceased, replaced by the grim, quiet work of the victors. This is the moment of the spoils of war. A mainstream historical fact is that the spoils of a battle were a huge part of a soldier's motivation. The loot from the enemy dead and the ransoms from the captured nobles were a way to make a fortune in a single day. The spoils were not just a bonus, they were a form of payment, a way to make a life of hardship and brutal fighting worthwhile. The distribution of the spoils was a chaotic, often brutal process, with men fighting over a dead man's boots or a broken sword. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some lords would have a special spoils wagon that would follow the army. The soldiers would be required to turn over their loot to the wagon, and the lord would then distribute it evenly to the men, or at least he would promise to. This was a way to prevent men from killing each other over a small prize. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or a rare attempt at a kind of medieval socialism. You, a common soldier, are now a part of this chaotic, brutal process. You are no longer fighting for your life. You are fighting for a piece of the pie. You see a comrade and a mercenary fighting over a small bag of coins. The mercenary is a professional, and he is not going to give up his prize easily. The fight is more brutal and more personal than the battle itself. You are no longer comrades, you are competitors. This is the unromantic, ugly side of victory. The spoils of war are not a prize. They are a curse. They turn men against each other, and they reveal a brutal, selfish reality that is far more terrifying than the fighting itself. You just hope you get a piece of the loot without having to fight a man who was just a moment ago your comrade. The spoils of war are a dark, ugly business, but something far more grim and somber is now afoot. It's the post-battle burials. A mainstream historical fact is that the burial of the dead after a major battle was a monumental and often overlooked task. Thousands of bodies, both friend and foe, had to be buried to prevent the spread of disease and to honor the fallen. The dead were often buried in a mass grave, a large, shallow pit that was a final resting place for all. The work was back-breaking, and it was a grim reminder of the cost of victory. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some armies would hire professional grave diggers, men who were paid to dig the mass graves and bury the dead. These men were often feared and reviled by both sides, as they were the harbingers of death. Historians still argue whether the grave diggers were an essential part of the post-battle cleanup or a kind of moral failing on the part of the commanders who didn't want to do the dirty work themselves. You are now a part of this grim, solemn task. You are digging a hole, and you are no longer a soldier. You are a grave digger. The work is slow and agonizing. You can smell the rot and the decay, a sickly sweet odor that will haunt your nightmares. You are no longer a man of war. You are a man of peace, a man who is trying to put a few inches of earth between the living and the dead. The sight of the dead, a jumble of bodies from both sides, is a sobering one. It's a reminder that a battle is not a contest between good and evil. It's a contest between two groups of men who are now united in death. This is the unromantic and far more human end of war. You just hope that one day someone will do the same for you. The grim work of the burials is a constant, haunting presence. But something is happening far from the battlefield. It's the chroniclers. A mainstream historical fact is that the history of a medieval battle was often written by the victors, the chroniclers. Men who were paid by the kings and nobles would write a version of events that was often skewed, exaggerated, and filled with a great deal of self-aggrandizement. They would turn a brutal, messy rout into a glorious, heroic victory. They would turn a pragmatic, tactical win into a triumph of honor and courage. The history you read is often not the history that happened. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some chroniclers would deliberately invent stories of heroic duels and glorious charges to make their lord look more impressive. These stories, a kind of medieval public relations, were a way to build a lord's reputation and secure his place in history. Historians still argue whether the chroniclers were just doing their job or if they were deliberately misleading their readers. You, the common foot soldier, know the truth. You know that the battle was a brutal, chaotic, and horrifying mess. You know that there were no grand, heroic charges. You know that the victory was a result of a muddy field and a clever flanking maneuver. But you also know that your truth will not be the one that is written down. The history will be written by the men in the castles, the men who were far from the mud and the blood. Your story, the story of a man who was fighting for his life, will be lost in the grand narrative of a king's glorious victory. The thought is a sobering one. It makes you realize that the history of a war is not about the men who fought it. It's about the men who wrote about it. You are a living witness to a history that will never be told. The chronicle will be written, and the truth will be lost. But the battle is over, and its consequences are just beginning to be felt. A mainstream historical fact is that a single medieval battle could reshape the map of Europe. The outcome of a battle could lead to the fall of a dynasty, the rise of a new king, or the redrawing of borders. A single, bloody day on a field could decide the fate of nations for centuries to come. The Battle of Hastings, for example, didn't just decide who would be the King of England, it set the stage for the next 100 years of English history. The Battle of Agincourt didn't just give the English a victory, it changed the very nature of warfare. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the outcome of a battle could also be decided by a single, personal grudge between two lords. A lord who hated his rival could refuse to send his troops to help him, leading to a loss that would change the course of history. Historians still argue whether these personal grudges were a major factor in warfare or just a small, insignificant part of a much bigger strategic picture. You, the foot soldier, are not a player in this grand game. You are a pawn. You are a small, anonymous piece of a much bigger puzzle. The battle you just fought will be a footnote in a history book, but its consequences will be felt by your children, and their children, and their children. You are a small part of a much bigger story, a story that is being written right now, a story that is far more important than a single life. The thought is a powerful one. It gives a sense of meaning to the horror you have just endured. The battle was not just about you, it was about the fate of a nation, the fate of a kingdom. You are a small part of a much bigger legacy, a legacy that will be felt for generations to come. The consequences of the battle are just beginning to be felt, but you are also a part of its legacy. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval battles shaped our modern world in ways we don't even realize. The lessons learned on the battlefield, the development of new weapons and new tactics, and the political consequences of the victories and defeats all contributed to the world we live in today. The feudal system, which was the backbone of medieval society, was slowly dismantled by the rise of professional armies and the power of the king. The battle you just fought was a part of that process. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the very language we use today is filled with words that have a medieval military origin. Words like flank, vanguard, rear guard, and lieutenant are all relics of a forgotten time. They are a kind of linguistic fossil, a testament to a world that was defined by warfare. Historians still argue whether the language of war is a reflection of the brutality of the past or a living reminder of the heroic deeds that shaped our world. You are a living, breathing part of that history. You are a link in a chain, a small part of a much bigger story that is still being told. The battles and the sieges, the glory and the horror, the chivalry and the brutality, it all contributed to the world we live in today. You are a part of that legacy, a man who was there, a man who saw it all. The battle is over, but its lessons and its consequences will live on. You are a witness to a part of history that will never be forgotten. The history is written, the legacy is secure, and you are finally home. You are a man who survived, but as you sit by the fire, you realize that something is missing. It's the memory of the fallen. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of the men who died in a medieval battle were anonymous. They were not knights with a coat of arms or kings with a legacy. They were just men with a name, a family, and a life that was snuffed out on a muddy field. Their names were not recorded, their stories were not told. They were just a number, a statistic in a history book. Their sacrifice was just a part of a larger story that did not have a place for their individual memory. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some villages would create a roll of honor for the men who had died in a battle. This was a piece of parchment that was hung in a church or a town hall, with the names of the fallen written on it. This was a small, personal act of remembrance, a way to keep the memory of the fallen alive. Historians still argue whether these rolls were a common practice or a rare act of kindness. You, a man who survived, feel a sense of survivor's guilt. You are alive. They are not. Their memory is fading, a ghost that is slowly disappearing into the mists of time. You just hope that you can remember them, that you can tell their story, even if no one else will. The battle is over. The fighting has ceased. The glory is gone. All that is left is the quiet, haunting memory of the men who fell. You sit by the fire, your eyes closed, and you remember their faces, their names, their stories. You are a keeper of the lost memories, a witness to a part of history that is slowly disappearing. The memory of the fallen is not a burden. It is a sacred trust. It is a reminder that a battle is not just a fight, it is a sacrifice. Now, as the fire dies down, and the silence of the night surrounds you, you can finally feel your mind begin to quiet. The sounds of battle, the cries of men, the clatter of steel, they are all fading, like echoes on a distant wind. The history is written, the legacy is set, and the memory of the fallen is now a part of you. The darkness is a comforting blanket, and the quiet is a gentle friend. You can feel your body relaxing, your muscles letting go of the tension of the day. The journey is over, and you are home. You are safe. The only thing left to do is to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the long, quiet darkness of the night envelop you. Let the sleep come. Let the dreams be sweet. End of script. Sweet dreams.